When I called my son Marcus 3 hours later, still stranded in my wheelchair at Westfield Shopping Center while my phone battery died, he said, "Mom, we got busy with the kids. Can't you just call an Uber?" That evening, sitting alone in my apartment after a stranger had to help me get home, I made a single phone call that would change everything. Within 48 hours, Marcus was crying on my doorstep, begging me to reverse the cancellation of their $15,000 European vacation that I'd secretly been funding, but by then, I'd also frozen the college funds I'd been contributing to, suspended the monthly allowance I'd been sending them, and canceled the credit cards I'd been paying for. Now Jessica wishes she'd never heard the words, "We'll be right." Back, Marcus regrets choosing his wife's shopping schedule over his mother's dignity. But me? I've never felt more powerful, and I've never slept better at night. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had family members treat you like an inconvenience when you needed them most? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who abandon you are about to discover exactly how much they needed what they just threw away. This story is about the Tuesday when I learned that 5 years of financial generosity and unconditional love meant nothing when my presence became inconvenient for my son's family shopping trip. When I discovered that the child I'd raised to value family loyalty had married a woman who saw me as nothing, more than a burden to be managed around her busy schedule. My name is Eleanor Patricia Williams, and I'm 70 years old. For the past 3 years, I'd been living independently in a senior apartment complex called Sunset Gardens in Phoenix, Arizona, about 20 minutes from my son Marcus and his family. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved from my longtime home in Denver after my husband Robert's passing. I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 12-year-old Sophia and 9-year-old Dylan, and be part of their daily lives in whatever way felt natural. But let me tell you about the life I built before I became the inconvenient grandmother who could be abandoned at shopping malls when my presence became tiresome. I was born Eleanor Patricia O'Brien in 1954, the daughter of an Irish Catholic family in Boston, who believed that hard work, education, and taking care of family were the 3 pillars of a meaningful life. My father Patrick worked as a foreman at the Boston Harbor shipyard, while my mother Catherine managed our household of 6 children with the kind of efficiency that would make a military general proud. I met my husband Robert Williams when I was 24 and working as a bank teller at First National Bank of Boston. Robert was 27, a mechanical engineer with dreams of moving west and building something meaningful in the growing technology sector. He was kind, ambitious, and had the rare quality of seeing potential in people and situations that others might overlook. When he proposed after 2 years of courtship, he painted a picture of a life together that would honor both our family's values while building something new and exciting. We married in a beautiful ceremony at St. Joseph's Cathedral in 1978, with both our family's blessings and hopes for grandchildren who would grow up with opportunities neither of our generations had enjoyed. For the first 3 years of our marriage, we lived in a small apartment in Cambridge while Robert worked for an engineering firm, and I continued at the bank, saving every penny we could for the move west that Robert had been planning since before we met. Marcus was born on a sunny April morning in 1981, after we'd been trying for children for 2 years. When I held him for the first time, seeing Robert's gentle eyes and my own stubborn chin, I thought I understood what all our planning and sacrifice had been leading toward. He was perfect, healthy, alert, with a disposition that seemed to blend Robert's methodical thinking with my own determination to see the best in every situation. When Marcus was 18 months old, Robert received an offer from a growing electronics company in Phoenix, Arizona. The salary was substantial, the opportunity for advancement was significant, and the cost of living would allow us to buy our first home and build the kind of stable family life we'd both dreamed of creating. The decision to leave Boston wasn't easy. It meant leaving both our extended families and the community where we'd both grown up. But we were young, optimistic, and convinced that building something new together was worth the sacrifice of familiar comfort. Phoenix in 1982 was a city in transition, growing rapidly as technology companies and retirees discovered the appeal of year-round sunshine and relatively affordable living. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a new development called Desert Bloom, where young families with children were creating the kind of neighborhood community that felt like a modern version of the close-knit Boston neighborhoods we'd left behind. For the next 20 years, Robert and I built the kind of life that represented everything we'd hoped for when we'd made the decision to leave Boston. Robert's career flourished as he moved from project engineer to department manager to eventually becoming vice president of operations for Phoenix Electronics Solutions, a mid-sized company that manufactured components for the growing computer industry. I found work as an administrative coordinator for the Scottsdale School District, which allowed me to maintain my career while having a schedule that aligned with Marcus's educational needs. Marcus thrived in Arizona. He was an excellent student, a natural athlete who excelled at baseball and tennis, and had inherited his father's methodical approach to problem-solving combined with my ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. He was popular without being arrogant, successful without being competitive with his friends, and had the kind of character that made other parents comment about what a good kid the Williams family had raised. During Marcus's high school years, Robert and I began planning for what we called our second chapter, the phase of life when Marcus would be launched into adulthood, and we could focus on travel, hobbies, and the kind of relaxed enjoyment that comes after decades of focused work and parenting. We'd paid off our mortgage early, built substantial savings, and were looking forward to grandchildren who would benefit from the financial security we'd created through careful planning and consistent effort. When Marcus graduated from high school, as salutatorian and received a full academic scholarship to Arizona State University's business program, Robert and I felt like all our sacrifices and planning had been validated. We were proud parents who'd raised a son capable of building on the foundation we'd provided while creating his own version of success and happiness. During Marcus's sophomore year at ASU, he met Jessica Rodriguez, a psychology major from a wealthy Scottsdale family who owned a chain of upscale restaurants throughout the Southwest. Jessica was beautiful, intelligent, and came from the kind of established Arizona family that could provide Marcus with social and professional connections that would enhance whatever career path he chose to pursue. When Marcus brought Jessica home for the first time, I was immediately impressed by her poise, her intelligence, and her apparent genuine affection for my son. She seemed interested in our family history, asked thoughtful questions about our move from Boston, and expressed appreciation for the values that had shaped Marcus's character. During that first dinner, Jessica had said something that I'd treasured. "I can see where Marcus gets his kindness and his work ethic. You and Mr. Williams have raised someone really special." The wedding took place 3 years later at the prestigious Arizona Biltmore Resort with 200 guests, flowers that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire wedding, and a reception that was featured in Phoenix Magazine's society pages. I was proud to be the mother of the groom, grateful that Marcus had found love with someone who clearly adored him, and who came from a family that would support his ambitions and help him build the kind of life he deserved. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to certain details during the wedding planning process. Jessica's family dominated the guest list, filling 3/4 of the venue with their extensive social and business networks, while Marcus's side included Robert and me, a few college friends, some co-workers from his first job at a Phoenix marketing firm, and several empty tables that highlighted the difference in our social circles compared to the Rodriguez family's extensive connections. During the reception, Jessica's mother, Carmen, had introduced me to other guests as Marcus's mother, the school district administrator, while she introduced her own family and friends with detailed descriptions of their business achievements, social positions, and community involvement. The introductions weren't intentionally dismissive, but they reflected a subtle hierarchy that positioned the Williams family as Marcus's past, while the Rodriguez family represented his future. I should have noticed that when Jessica talked about their future plans, those plans centered around building their social and professional network within Phoenix's established business community, with little consideration for maintaining close relationships with extended family members who didn't contribute to those networking goals. But I was happy for Marcus, grateful that he'd found love, and optimistic that Jessica would come to appreciate the close family relationships that had always been central to the Williams family culture. I thought time and familiarity would help Jessica understand that loving Marcus meant embracing the people who'd shaped him, not just the version of him that fit into her social aspirations. The first few years of their marriage seemed to confirm my optimism. Jessica was warm and inclusive, inviting Robert and me to family celebrations and holiday gatherings. When Sophia was born 2 years after the wedding, Jessica seemed genuinely grateful for my help during those difficult first months when sleep deprivation and new parent anxiety made every day feel like an endurance test. I spent countless hours rocking Sophia when she had colic, preparing meals for the exhausted new parents, and providing the kind of practical support that made new parenthood manageable. When Dylan arrived 3 years later, the pattern repeated, with me serving as the reliable grandmother who could be counted on for emergency babysitting, meal preparation, and hands-on assistance that allowed Jessica to maintain her part-time work as a family counselor while adjusting to life with 2 young children. "Eleanor, you're a godsend," Jessica had said repeatedly during those early parenting years. I don't know how families manage without having experienced grandparents nearby to help with situations like this. At the time, I'd interpreted these expressions of gratitude as evidence that my presence was valued and that my contributions were making a meaningful difference in their quality of life. What I hadn't recognized was that Jessica's appreciation was focused on my usefulness during crisis periods, rather than my value as a permanent part of their family structure. The distinction became clear when both children were school-aged and my intensive childcare assistance was no longer needed on a daily basis. Instead of the continued gratitude and inclusion I'd expected after years of significant support, I found that Jessica's appreciation seemed to decrease as my utility diminished. Robert's death 5 years ago had changed everything about my situation and my relationship with Marcus's family. Robert had been my partner, my best friend, and my buffer in social situations where I felt uncertain about family dynamics or social expectations. When he passed away suddenly from a heart attack at age 67, I lost not just my husband, but also my primary source of emotional support and my strongest advocate within our family structure. The grief was overwhelming, but Marcus and Jessica had been wonderfully supportive during those first difficult months. They'd helped with funeral arrangements, assisted with legal and financial paperwork, and had included me in family activities in ways that made me feel like I was still part of a loving, connected family unit, even without Robert's presence. When I'd decided to sell the family home in Desert Bloom, the house held too many memories, and maintaining it alone felt overwhelming. Marcus had suggested that I consider moving closer to their family rather than staying isolated in a house that was too large and too filled with reminders of my loss. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone during this transition," Marcus had said as we'd discussed my housing options. "Phoenix has some beautiful senior communities where you could have your own space, but also access to social activities and support services. And being closer to us would mean you could be part of Sophia and Dylan's daily lives in whatever way feels comfortable." The suggestion had seemed like a natural solution to everyone's concerns about my adjustment to widowhood. I could maintain my independence while being close enough that Marcus wouldn't worry about my isolation, and Sophia and Dylan could have regular access to their grandmother during these important formative years. Sunset Gardens had seemed perfect when Marcus and Jessica had toured it with me. The apartment was spacious and comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a balcony overlooking the community's beautifully landscaped courtyard. The complex offered social activities, transportation services for shopping and appointments, and the kind of security that would give Marcus peace of mind about my safety and well-being. Most importantly, The location was only 20 minutes from Marcus and Jessica's home in the upscale Ahwatukee neighborhood, close enough for regular visits and family involvement, but far enough that I wouldn't be interfering with their daily routines or privacy. The sale of my Desert Bloom house had netted $285,000 after paying off the small remaining mortgage and covering real estate fees. Instead of keeping all that money for my own future needs, I'd given $120,000 to Marcus and Jessica as what I'd called an early inheritance to help them pay off their mortgage and fund some home improvements they'd been planning. The remaining $165,000 I'd kept in savings and investment accounts to cover my living expenses at Sunset Gardens and provide financial security for my remaining years. At the time, giving Marcus and Jessica the majority of my house sale proceeds had seemed like a generous way to help secure their family's financial future, while ensuring that I wouldn't be seen as a financial burden on their household. Marcus had been grateful, Jessica had been gracious, and I'd felt good about contributing to the beautiful home where I would spend time with my grandchildren and be part of their family celebrations. What I didn't understand was that my financial contribution would eventually be reframed as my choice, rather than acknowledged as the generous gift that had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. What I didn't anticipate was that Jessica would begin to see my presence in their lives as an obligation they'd inherited, rather than a blessing they'd chosen to embrace. For the first year after moving to Sunset Gardens, the arrangement had worked exactly as Marcus had promised. I maintained my independence while being available to help with Sophia and Dylan when needed. I contributed to family celebrations, provided occasional babysitting that allowed Marcus and Jessica to have date nights, and enjoyed the kind of grandmother role that enriched everyone's lives without creating burden or obligation. But somewhere during the second year, my helpfulness had transformed from appreciated contribution to expected service. The thank yous had become less frequent. The consideration for my own schedule and preferences had become non-existent. The assumption that I would be available whenever needed had become absolute, while the reciprocal consideration for my own needs and limitations had disappeared entirely. Jessica had begun making plans that assumed my availability without consulting me first. Date nights were scheduled with the expectation that I would provide childcare, even when I had my own social activities or appointments planned. Shopping trips and errands were organized around Jessica's schedule, with my transportation needs treated as an afterthought that could be managed with last-minute arrangements. Most telling of all, Jessica had begun making comments about my living situation that suggested she was already anticipating changes to our current arrangement. Comments about how independent I was becoming, observations about how well I was adjusting to life at Sunset Gardens, and casual mentions of friends whose elderly parents had thrived after moving to higher care facilities that provided more appropriate levels of social interaction and support. I'd told myself that these comments were just Jessica thinking out loud about future possibilities, normal concerns that any daughter-in-law might have about long-term care planning. For aging parents, I'd told myself that the increasing expectations and decreasing appreciation were temporary adjustments that would improve once everyone settled into a more comfortable routine. But looking back now, I can see that every interaction over the past year had been colored by Jessica's growing view of me as a convenience, rather than a person deserving of consideration and respect. Every casual request for babysitting had been presented as an opportunity for me to spend time with my grandchildren, rather than acknowledged as a favor that deserved appreciation. Every expectation of my availability had been framed as natural family obligation, rather than recognized as a choice I was making to prioritize their needs over my own preferences. The most insidious aspect of this gradual transformation had been how it had affected my relationship with Marcus. Because Jessica's manipulation was subtle and was always framed as concern for family harmony rather than self-serving convenience, Marcus had never recognized it as problematic behavior that required his intervention. Instead, Marcus had gradually adopted Jessica's perspective that my desires for consideration and respect were unreasonable expectations rather than normal human needs that deserved acknowledgement. When I'd mentioned feeling taken for granted, Marcus had responded with reassurances about how much the family valued me, but without any recognition that their behavior might need to change, rather than my expectations needing adjustment. The pattern had reached its most obvious expression 6 months ago, when Sophia had been invited to a classmate's birthday party at a trampoline park. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon when I'd planned to attend a book club meeting at Sunset Gardens, one of the few social activities I'd maintained that provided me with companionship and intellectual stimulation outside of my family relationships. When Jessica had called to ask if I could drive Sophia to the party because something had come up with her own schedule, I'd explained that I had my own commitment that afternoon and suggested that Sophia could miss this particular party or that Jessica could rearrange her plans to accommodate her daughter's social event. Jessica's response had been immediate and revealing. "Eleanor, I thought you'd want to prioritize spending time with Sophia over sitting around talking about books with people you barely know." The casual dismissal of my social relationships and personal interests had been shocking. But even more disturbing had been the underlying assumption that my time and energy belonged to their family rather than to me. That my desire to maintain friendships and intellectual stimulation was somehow selfish when it conflicted with their convenience. When I'd brought this incident to Marcus's attention, his response had been predictably disappointing. "Mom, I think Jessica was just stressed about her schedule conflict. She probably didn't mean to sound dismissive of your activities." But Jessica had meant to sound dismissive. She'd meant to establish that my personal interests were less important than their family needs, and that my role in their lives was to be available when convenient rather than to maintain my own independent social identity. That conversation had been a turning point in my understanding of how my relationship with Marcus and Jessica had evolved since Robert's death. Without Robert's presence to balance family dynamics and advocate for my needs, I'd gradually been repositioned from valued family member to useful resource whose primary function was to provide services when requested. The wheelchair situation had developed 3 months ago after I'd fallen in my apartment and fractured my ankle. The injury wasn't serious, but it required a temporary period of limited mobility while the bone healed and I completed physical therapy. My doctor had recommended using a wheelchair for longer outings to avoid fatigue and prevent re-injury during the healing process. I'd expected this temporary mobility limitation to increase my family's consideration for my needs and circumstances. Instead, it had seemed to accelerate Jessica's view of me as a burden that required management rather than a person who deserved accommodation and respect. Shopping trips that had previously been planned around my preferences and energy levels were now organized around Jessica's schedule, with my wheelchair treated as an inconvenience that slowed down their efficient completion of errands. Family outings were restructured to minimize the complications of wheelchair accessibility, often resulting in my exclusion from activities I would have enjoyed and could have participated in with minor adjustments. Most insulting of all, Jessica had begun making decisions about my participation in activities without consulting me, then presenting those decisions as considerations for my comfort and safety. Birthday parties became too crowded for wheelchair navigation. Restaurant choices were limited to places Jessica deemed appropriate for my mobility needs. Even family gatherings at their home were subtly restructured to minimize the disruption of accommodating my wheelchair. The language Jessica used when discussing my temporary disability had been particularly revealing. She consistently referred to my wheelchair as Eleanor's situation or the mobility issue, as if my medical needs were a problem that required management rather than a temporary condition that deserved accommodation and support. But what had hurt most wasn't Jessica's obvious impatience with my mobility limitations. It was Marcus's passive acceptance of his wife's attitude and his failure to advocate for his mother's dignity and inclusion. The son I'd raised to value family loyalty and compassion had gradually adopted his wife's view of me as a burden rather than defending the woman who'd sacrificed decades of her life to ensure his success and happiness. This morning's abandonment at Westfield Shopping Center hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It had been the inevitable result of months of systematic devaluation of my worth and dignity. Jessica had finally moved from subtle exclusion to overt abandonment, confident that Marcus would support her convenience over his mother's well-being. But what neither Jessica nor Marcus had anticipated was that the woman they'd been treating as a helpless burden actually possessed the financial resources and determination to remind them exactly how much power they'd been taking for granted. What they didn't know, as I sat alone in that mall food court watching my phone battery die, while families around me enjoyed their time together, was that I'd been making very different phone calls over the past few weeks. Calls to financial institutions, travel agencies, and legal advisors who were about to help me demonstrate the difference between being dependent and being generous. Tomorrow, Jessica and Marcus would discover that there's a significant distinction between supporting someone who needs help and exploiting someone who chooses to be helpful. Tomorrow, they would learn that abandoning someone in a wheelchair might provide temporary convenience, but it could also trigger consequences they'd never imagined possible. Tomorrow, the power dynamic in our family would be permanently reversed, and the grandmother they'd left stranded at a shopping mall would become the person who controlled whether their dreams became reality or their comfortable lifestyle became a memory. But tonight, I was just a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair, sitting alone in my apartment, planning the phone call that would change everything. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, I want you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button, right now, because what you're about to hear is going to make you rethink everything you know about family dynamics and the power of financial independence. And while you're at it, ring that notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to stories that prove age is not a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of life experience. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this question. Have you ever been treated like an inconvenience by the very people you've sacrificed the most for? Have you ever found yourself questioning whether your generosity was actually enabling people to take you for granted? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you simply stopped being available for people who only value you when it's convenient for them? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your experiences matter. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in recognizing when kindness becomes exploitation, and more importantly, how to reclaim your power when family members mistake your love for weakness. You see, Eleanor's story isn't just about one afternoon at a shopping mall. It's about a pattern that plays out in families across the world every single day. It's about the subtle transformation that happens when your contributions become expectations, when your presence becomes conditional, and when your value as a person gets reduced to your utility as a service provider. But here's what makes Eleanor's story different from the countless other stories of family exploitation that never get resolved. Eleanor understood something that most people in her situation never figure out. She understood that respect isn't something you can beg for or negotiate. It's something you have to require. And sometimes, requiring respect means demonstrating exactly what life looks like when people lose access to the benefits they've been taking for granted. Today's story is going to challenge some deeply held beliefs about family obligation and unconditional love. We're going to explore the difference between being supportive and being exploited, between being generous and being taken advantage of, between maintaining family harmony and enabling family dysfunction. And if you're someone who's currently in a situation where your kindness is being mistaken for weakness, where your availability is being assumed rather than appreciated, where your financial support is being treated as entitlement rather than gift, then Eleanor's story is going to show you exactly how to turn that dynamic around. But I want to be clear about something before we continue. This isn't about encouraging family conflict or promoting revenge as a solution to relationship problems. This is about understanding that healthy relationships require mutual respect, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are exploiting your kindness is to stop enabling their behavior by removing the benefits they've been taking for granted. Eleanor's transformation from abandoned grandmother to powerful matriarch didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened because she reached a point where preserving her dignity became more important than preserving an artificial peace. It happened because she finally understood that being treated with respect wasn't a privilege she had to earn. It was a requirement she had the right to enforce. The phone call Eleanor made that Tuesday evening wasn't made in anger, though she had every right to be furious. It wasn't made in desperation, though she'd been abandoned in one of the most vulnerable situations imaginable. It was made with the kind of cold, calculated precision that comes from finally understanding exactly how much power you've been giving away and making the decision to take it back. You see, while Marcus and Jessica had been busy reorganizing their lives around their own convenience, treating Eleanor's presence as optional and her contributions as automatic, Eleanor had been doing something they never expected. She'd been paying attention. She'd been taking notes. And most importantly, she'd been preparing for the day when their casual cruelty would finally cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That day had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon at Westfield Shopping Center when a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair discovered that the family she'd sacrificed decades to support had finally revealed exactly how little her dignity meant to them. But what Marcus and Jessica didn't understand, as they went about their day after abandoning Eleanor at that mall, was that they'd just triggered a response from someone who'd spent 30 years in the business world, someone who understood contracts and financial leverage, someone who'd been managing money and relationships long before they were born. They'd awakened something in Eleanor that they'd never seen before, because she'd never needed to use it. They'd pushed someone who'd spent her entire life prioritizing other people's comfort to the point where she finally decided to prioritize her own power. And the beautiful thing about Eleanor's story, the thing that makes it so satisfying and so instructive, is that everything she did in response to their abandonment was completely legal, completely ethical, and completely within her rights as an independent adult who'd been freely choosing to support their lifestyle. The difference was that she stopped choosing to do it. The European vacation that Marcus and Jessica had been planning for months, Eleanor had been quietly funding it through monthly transfers to their vacation savings account, the same way she'd been contributing to countless other aspects of their comfortable lifestyle. The college funds for Sophia and Dylan that Marcus and Jessica assumed would continue growing until the children reached 18. Eleanor had been making quarterly contributions that significantly exceeded what Marcus and Jessica were contributing themselves. The credit cards that Jessica used for shopping trips and restaurant meals, the ones that allowed her to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, Eleanor had been paying those bills, treating them as a way to help her son's family avoid financial stress while building their future. All of these financial arrangements had been Eleanor's choice, made from a place of love and a desire to help her family build the kind of life she'd always dreamed they could have. But they'd never been obligations, contracts, or requirements that Eleanor had to continue regardless of how she was treated. Marcus and Jessica had made the fundamental mistake of confusing Eleanor's generosity with their entitlement. They'd forgotten that every benefit they'd been receiving from her was something she was choosing to provide, not something they had a right to demand. That Tuesday evening, sitting alone in her apartment after being abandoned at a shopping mall, Eleanor finally decided to stop choosing to provide those benefits to people who demonstrated they didn't value the person providing them. The phone call she made wasn't to a lawyer, though she'd consulted with legal advisors to ensure everything she was planning was completely above board. It wasn't to a financial planner, though she'd worked with experts to organize her assets in ways that maximized her control and minimized their access. The phone call was to her bank, to begin implementing a plan she'd been developing for weeks, as she'd watched the pattern of disrespect and casual cruelty escalate to levels that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Within 48 hours, Marcus and Jessica would discover that the comfortable lifestyle they'd been taking for granted was actually far more fragile than they'd realized. They would learn that the financial security they'd assumed was permanent was actually dependent on maintaining a relationship with someone they'd been treating as dispensable. Most importantly, they would understand that the grandmother they'd left stranded in a wheelchair at a shopping mall was actually the person who controlled whether their dreams came true or their plans fell apart. But before we get to that moment of reckoning, before we see Marcus crying on Eleanor's doorstep and Jessica frantically trying to undo months of casual cruelty, we need to understand how Eleanor got to the point where she was capable of that kind of decisive action. We need to go back to the beginning to understand the foundation of strength and independence that Eleanor had built long before she became a grandmother, long before she moved to Phoenix, long before she found herself in a wheelchair being abandoned by people who should have been protecting her. Because Eleanor's power didn't come from anger or revenge. It came from a lifetime of understanding that respect is earned through behavior, that love is demonstrated through actions, and that family relationships, like all relationships, have to be based on mutual consideration rather than one-sided exploitation. The woman who made that phone call Tuesday evening wasn't the helpless victim that Marcus and Jessica had been treating her as. She was a woman who'd built a life, raised a family, survived loss, and maintained her independence through decades of challenges that had taught her exactly how strong she really was. She was a woman who'd finally decided that preserving other people's comfort was less important than preserving her own dignity. She was a woman who'd reached the point where teaching her family a lesson about respect had become more important than enabling their disrespectful behavior. And she was a woman who'd realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available for them to take for granted. So grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and prepare to hear about how a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair turned the tables on family members who thought they could treat her however they wanted without consequences. Prepare to learn how Eleanor Williams transformed from abandoned grandmother to powerful matriarch in less than 48 hours, and prepare to discover that age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of resources, relationships, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of experience dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness. Because Eleanor's story is about to show you exactly what happens when someone who's been underestimated finally decides to demonstrate their true power. The lesson here isn't just about family dynamics or financial control. It's about understanding that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept, and that sometimes the biggest gift you can give someone is the consequence of their own behavior. Eleanor's story begins in Boston in 1954, but the part that changes everything starts on a Tuesday evening in Phoenix in 2024, when a woman who'd spent her entire life putting other people first finally decided it was time to put herself first. And once you hear how that decision played out, you'll never look at family obligations, financial independence, or the power of strategic thinking the same way again. So make sure you're subscribed, because this story is going to take some turns that will surprise you, inspire you, and possibly change how you handle the difficult people in your own life. Eleanor Williams was about to teach her family a lesson they'd never forget. And in the process, she was going to teach all of us something about the difference between being taken advantage of and being truly powerful. The transformation starts now. My name is Eleanor Patricia Williams, and I'm 70 years old. For the past 3 years, I'd been living independently in a senior apartment complex called Sunset Gardens in Phoenix, Arizona, about 20 minutes from my son Marcus and his family. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved from my longtime home in Denver after my husband Robert's passing. I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 12-year-old Sophia and 9-year-old Dylan, and be part of their daily lives in whatever way felt natural. But let me tell you about the life I built before I became the inconvenient grandmother who could be abandoned at shopping malls when my presence became tiresome. I was born Eleanor Patricia O'Brien in 1954, the daughter of an Irish Catholic family in Boston who believed that hard work, education, and taking care of family were the three pillars of a meaningful life. My father, Patrick, worked as a foreman at the Boston Harbor shipyard, while my mother, Catherine, managed our household of 6 children with the kind of efficiency that would make a military general proud. Growing up in a working-class Boston neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s taught me lessons that would serve me well throughout my life, though I didn't understand their value at the time. We lived in a 3-story house that my father had purchased with savings from 15 years of shipyard work, a house that represented everything my parents had sacrificed to provide for their children's futures. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but in the way that creates community rather than intrusion. Mrs. Flanagan next door would watch us children when my mother had to work late cleaning houses for the wealthy families on Beacon Hill. Mr. Kowalski across the street would help my father with home repairs in exchange for my father's assistance with electrical work at the small grocery store Mr. Kowalski owned downtown. It was a world where favors were exchanged without keeping score, where children were raised by the entire community, and where reputation was built through consistency and reliability rather than wealth or social connections. But it was also a world where money was always scarce, where opportunities had to be earned through merit rather than inheritance, and where planning for the future required careful saving and strategic thinking about education and career choices. My parents had immigrated from County Cork in Ireland during the 1940s, arriving in Boston with nothing but determination and a work ethic that would eventually allow them to purchase that 3-story house and send all 6 of their children to college. They'd met at a community dance for Irish immigrants, married after a courtship that lasted 2 years, while they both saved money and established themselves in their new country. Patrick O'Brien had found work at the Boston Harbor shipyard within a month of arriving in America, starting as a general laborer and working his way up to foreman through 15 years of showing up early, staying late, and treating every task as an opportunity to prove his value to supervisors who were initially skeptical about hiring recent immigrants. Catherine O'Brien had taken work as a domestic servant for wealthy families in the Back Bay area, cleaning houses and caring for children while learning English and observing how successful American families managed their households and raised their children. She'd saved every penny she could from her wages, living in a boarding house for Irish women and wearing the same 3 dresses for 2 years, while accumulating the money that would eventually become the down payment on the house where I grew up. By the time I was old enough to understand adult conversations, my parents had achieved a level of financial security